December lecture this morning. If you don't know me, my name is Rob Muscat, President of the Military History Society of New South Wales. It's wonderful to see our members, our non-members, our visitors, and a lot of new faces. So thank you for joining us this morning. We as a society have been around for a long time, and our special features are our lectures. They occur on the first Saturday of each month. This is our last one for 2024. We will reconvene in 2025, and our first one is on the 1st of February next year. We have our AGM, and then it's followed by our lecture. So it'll be beautiful and great to see you there again next year. But this morning we have the privilege of hearing from Dr Virginia Furner, and this morning's lecture is not Pearl Harbor. I know you might be a bit confused, but we are going to commemorate in a small way the anniversary of Pearl Harbor this morning. But this morning's lecture is Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War. And the legacy of Florence Nightingale for modern nursing is outstanding, continues to this present day. Her participation in the Crimean War was instrumental in enabling her to establish the principles of modern healthcare and nursing and social reform. Dr Virginia Furner, our speaker, has been a specialist at the Alvin Centre in Sydney for the past 37 years. And Virginia has considerable experience in lecturing to undergraduate medical students at the 4 universities in Sydney. She's also provided postgraduate training to medical colleagues from many parts of Southeast Asia. Virginia has always had an interest in military history and has visited over 60 military museums worldwide with her husband, Major Paul Fandel, retired. Can we put our hands together and welcome Virginia?
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you this morning. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge their connection to land, water and community. The first slide is just to remind us that today is the 7th of December and we pay our respects to all those who fell on this date in 1941. So I've already heard 2 excellent presentations this year on nurses in warfare, and so I hope you'll allow me to speak on this topic. I'm not a military historian or an archivist, and I'm not a nurse, so I've still chosen to speak about Florence Nightingale, and particularly in regard to the Crimean War. So why have I chosen to do this presentation? I guess we would all assume that for us here that we know that war is essentially futile. However, there have been a number of positive things that have occurred that have impacted on medicine and on patient care as a consequence of armed conflict. And this is the first presentation I've prepared in regard to those positive outcomes that we can attribute to war. So I'd also like to acknowledge the wonderful achievements of Florence Nightingale and wonderful work done by all nurses and midwives in our system every day. We also acknowledge the dedication of the nurses who have given and continue to give service during armed conflict. We especially acknowledge the dedication and sacrifices of our nurses during COVID-19 pandemic. It is estimated more than 1,500 nurses died as a consequence of their work during early 2020. We thank them all for their sacrifice. So just an overview of what I'll be talking about this morning, a bit of background relating to Florence Nightingale, conditions in the Crimean War and the achievements of the nurses in that sector, a brief outline of the battles and the legacies of the Crimean War. As I said, I'm not a military historian, so I will only choose to focus on a few aspects of the war. We'll look at the achievements and legacies of Florence Nightingale, and it really does behove me to mention the Florence Nightingale-Sydney connection, of which I'm sure many of you are aware, and it is an important aspect. I'm going to get you to do a little bit of work because there are actually 4 quiz questions, and we have a book prize for those who do get the answers. So when the time comes, I'll get you to put your hand up. Stay awake. So Florence Nightingale is pictured there on the slide. So she was born in Florence, Italy, and like her sister, Parthenope, they were named after their place of birth. Parthenope was in what is now Naples for her sister, and she was born in Florence, Italy. They were born into a reasonably wealthy family in England, and they had a comfortable lifestyle in Leaderhurst, Derbyshire, and Embley Park in Hampshire. Florence excelled in maths and could speak 5 languages. She received a lot of her education from her father, and she focused on philosophy, history, and literature. She was raised in a liberal Unitarian household, and I'll just mention a bit more about that in a moment. She's said to have received a number of calls from God to devote her life to the service of others. She ultimately attended the institution of Protestant deaconesses at Kaiserswerth and observed the care of the sick and learned basic nursing skills there. It was very unusual for a woman of her social status to embark upon a career, particularly one that involved nursing at that time in her life. Now, just for your information, Unitarianism, this is a typical church in the United States where this Christian sect does have some prominence. It first started in Poland and Transylvania in the 15th, 16th century, and it is a Christian religion. The main difference to the Anglican religion, which she had ultimately adhered to for most of her life, is that Unitarianism does not believe in the Trinity, the Father, Son and Holy Ghost, but rather on conscience. So I've included a number of lithographs throughout the presentation from a variety of sources, and it's just to add a bit of colour to the text, otherwise you'd be just seeing print. So just bear with me while I show those pictures. I'm not going to talk to them in detail, but you can see there the typical British soldiers that have been depicted for leading for the Crimean War in February 1854. So 171 years on, who remembers what the Crimean War was about? Who fought it? Who won? What were the terms of the peace settlement? What were its after effects? And what lessons are applicable to the 21st century warfare that were ultimately lost on European powers following the Crimean War? It's an interesting issue to think about. The Crimean War took place between October 1853 and February 1856.
I'm sorry. I've got a cough that's just not going to go away.
Take care. So it's probably not something we think about these days very much, except for Florence Nightingale. We mostly remember 3 things, I guess. The charge of the Light Brigade, which I'll be talking about. One could argue the mismanagement of the British Army and other forces in the war, and ultimately it's something we remember as Florence Nightingale. So why did the Crimean War take place? Basically, the Turkish Ottoman Empire declared war on Russia, Russia had exerted a number of demands to exercise power over the Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Sultan. There was a dispute between Russia and France as well over privileges of the Russian Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches in Palestine, something that's been going on for centuries. And with Russian expansion into the Danube region, and Russia had ambitions in the Black Sea. One of the pivotal events of the Crimean War was the destruction of the Turkish fleet at the seaport of Sinope on the Black Sea in November the 30th, 1853. So 171 years and 1 week ago that event took place. And it resulted in 4,000 sailors, the almost entire Turkish fleet, being killed in that action. The allies of Turkey in the Crimean War, Britain, France, Sardinia, Piedmont, Italy was not united at that point in time. They united to curb Russian expansion. It was fought on the Crimean Peninsula in Russia, which lies between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. The pivotal events relating to Florence Nightingale took place at the British troop base and hospital for the sick and wounded, established in Eskidar across the Bosphorus from what was then Constantinople. And this is just a map which shows you here the Crimea, fairly pivotal with the Russian Empire above and the Ottoman Empire below, and the Black Sea in the middle. And so we'll be talking about some of these events. I think it's interesting, and I'll show you a number of actual photographs that were taken during the Crimean War. And these were early days of warfare photography, and I think they were absolutely amazing. This was an early photo taken at near the hospital of officers and men of the 93rd Highland Regiment shortly before their engagement in the war in 1854, and it shows you the typical costumes of the soldiers at the time. An amazing photograph, I think. So your first question for the morning is, name the 3 common words that have been adopted into the English language that have originated during the Crimean War. As I said, it's 107. Balaclava. You win a prize, so click that at the end. Any other words come to mind?
Rich playing.
Sorry?
Rich playing. Rich.
I'm not quite sure about that one. You might be right.
Well, there's the bridge on the Golden Horn where the British soldiers, officers came together and they started practicing this game, which initially started up in Britain, but they developed it during the war, so allegedly the bridge play was invented.
Good explanation. I think we give it to you.
We'll give it to you. Yes. Okay, so I got you a bit stumped with that. Sorry?
Ottoman?
No, not the Ottoman word I think existed before the Crimean War, I think. The words I'm thinking of anyway.
Cardigan.
Cardigan.
No.
Thank you, Paul.
Order.
So that came up right as I showed the slide, but I'll pay that, Paul.
Well,
So cardigan is certainly one from
Raglan.
and raglan is the other one. Thank you. So we've got 3 words. Well done. So cardigan was named after James Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan, the British Army Major General who led the charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava. It is modelled after the knitted wool waistcoat that British officers wore during the war. And you can see there the 2 representations of what is the cardigan in the Crimea and what is the cardigan today. So remember that word that originated in the 1850s. Raglan was the other one. And it's a sleeve that extends in one piece to the collar. It was named after Lord Raglan, the first Baron Raglan, who was said to have worn a coat with this style of sleeve after he lost his arm in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And it was invented by Exclusion in London for Lord Raglan to allow him room to use his sword in battle. Lord Raglan, as you'll hear, was chosen to lead the British troops in the Crimea at the age of 65. And remember that Britain had not fought in a battle for over 40 years since the Battle of Waterloo. And at age 65, leading his men the charge of the Light Brigade, he had never served in the field previously. Lord Raglan died of dysentery before the end of the Crimean War. The other one is Balaclava. It was terribly cold in winters in the Crimea, and so British troops particularly suffered from cold due to improper clothing. And so people at home began knitting warm clothing for the soldiers, which they could wear warm caps under their helmets. And the soldiers called them balaclavas, obviously after the battle. We think more about balaclavas these days in terms of crime rather than the Crimea. So the essential battles of the Crimean War: the Battle of Alma, September 1854, Balaclava, October 1854, Battle of Inkerman, November 1854. All of those battles lasted for one day. The siege of Sevastopol was different. October 1854 was the major operation of the war, and it lasted 11 months. It involved 50,000 British and French troops, and in 1855 they were joined by 10,000 Piedmontese troops as well. And it involved besieging Sevastopol, which was a port and fortress city, and finally they were able to capture the main naval base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And this is a lithograph, which is in the Library of Congress in Washington, and it shows you British forces firing upon the Sevastopol in the siege. So we can't go past the events of the Crimean War without talking about the charge of the Light Brigade. And this is a lithograph depicting the actual battle. So the battle involves what are called the Heavy and the Light Brigade of the British troops. The Light Brigade consisted of a number of brigades of the British Army, the 4th and 13th Light Dragoons, 17th Lancers, 8th and 11th Hussars. And they were under the command of Major General James Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan. And essentially they were called the Light Brigade because they were on light, fast, unarmoured horses and armed with sabres and lances. The Heavy Brigade consisted of the 4th Irish Dragoon Guards, 5th Dragoon Guards, 6th Inniskilling Dragoons and the Scots Greys, under the command of Major General James York Scarlett. And they were on large, heavy chargers, armed with cavalry swords and equipped with metal helmets. So we all know that the charge of the Light Brigade was a failed military action involving the British Light Cavalry armed with lances and sabres. The aim was to prevent the Russians from removing captured guns, naval guns, from the overrun Turkish positions at the time. It was a battle that was full of miscommunications in the chain of command, and this ultimately resulted in the Light Brigade being sent on a frontal assault against a different, well-prepared battery of defensive Russian fire. The British were forced to retreat, resulting in high casualties and no essential gain. The responsibility remains controversial, and you will read lots of accounts on both aspects of the charge, but certainly what was evident was that Lewis Edward Nolan was assigned to deliver the vague written orders as well as verbal orders to the commanders of the British troops, but he died in the first minute of the assault. So lots of occurrences during the battle. It is often said, therefore, that the actions demonstrated logistical and tactical failures in mismanagement, as well as the adverse effects of the commanders' personalities, their incompetence, and their internal rivalries. However, as John Harris says in a book that he wrote in 1973, on starving horses, the Heavy Brigade went twice into action, and the Light Brigade offered to go a second time if necessary, and doubtless would have done if called upon. So, if nothing else, it depicts the courage of the foot soldier and the cavalry in that action. You also may well remember the charge of the Light Brigade at Palm. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. It relates to theirs, not ours, and depicts the valor of the cavalry in carrying out their orders. So who was the British poet laureate who wrote the poem?
Tennyson.
Alfred Tennyson, thank you. Who published the poem 6 weeks after the battle. Quite a accomplishment.
Published in the Times.
Sorry?
It was published in the Times.
In the Times, yes. So, just as a way of background, before the arrival of Florence Nightingale and her nurses, this is just the conditions in the Crimea. The initial dispatches from Britain's first war correspondent, William Howard Russell, caused outrage at home. William Howard Russell was an Irish journalist, and he wrote dispatches relating to the battles. In June 1854, there were 30,000 British soldiers sailed from Bulgaria across the Black Sea to the Crimea. Quite a large contingent. Cholera and scurvy were rampant. Soldiers were starving. Transport was inadequate. Stores, tents, bedding, medicine chests were left behind. The winters were very cold, and I read reports of the barrels of the guns freezing and the soldiers' hands sticking to the barrels. They were waiting shipments of stores like boots, which were often sent to the wrong port, and in one instance when the shoes did arrive, all of the shipment were only left-sided boots. It was quite an ineptitude. There were no clothes, blankets and bandages, splints and morphine or chloroform in those days. The wounded were treated where they lay on the ground, in the open, in farmyards and on the battlefield. At Scutari, which is where the hospital was established for the British troops, the sick and wounded had to be evacuated hundreds of miles to the General Hospital in Turkey, and the artillery barracks nearby were converted into the barrack hospital. The conditions there were no better. There were rats, lice, bugs, fleas, cold, filthy conditions, dilapidated buildings, contaminated drinking water, and severe overcrowding. Cholera and what was called Crimean fever was rampant. Most likely Crimean fever was brucellosis, an infection which you can get from goats, cows, sheep and camels. And it is postulated that in fact Florence Nightingale had chronic brucellosis all of her remaining life. There was also typhus, typhoid and a lot of dysentery. In the first 6 months of the Crimean War, 70% of the men from the 8 regiments died from disease. Florence was a lifelong friend of Sidney Hubert, who was the Secretary of War at the time, and he wrote to her and requested that she lead a group of nurses to Scutari. I just mentioned Athena. Athena was an owlet that Florence rescued from children playing at the Pantheon when she was on holidays, and she brought her back to England with her. and became her pet and used to sit on her shoulder. It is reputed to have been at times a very nasty bird and would peck at all the visitors who came to see her. However, she was devastated when Athena died whilst she was en route to the Crimea. And I believe this is the actual bird, taxidermid, is in the Florence Nightingale Museum in London. So just a little aside about her pet. So on her arrival at the hospital in Turkey, she arrived with 38 nurses, her aunt May Smith, 15 Catholic nuns, and they arrived on the 5th of November. So when they first arrived, I guess due to pride reasons, they were totally ignored by the army doctors. It was unheard of for women to be of this profession, and particularly to be in a war zone. But they waited, and within weeks there were more men in the hospital than were laying siege to Sevastopol, and that were in the horrific conditions I've described. Overwhelmed, the army doctors finally asked Florence and her nurses to assist. And that's a lithograph just depicting the nurses with the wounded at the Scutari Hospital. And a lithograph from 1856 showing the barracks used as a hospital during the Crimean War. It's interesting, and I'll show you some pictures later, but just to note that it's actually light, airy conditions in that building, and so it was a forerunner for what she later proposed with her pavilion design of hospitals. It's amazing what the nurses achieved in that arena. She used private funds to purchase food, clothing, linen and hospital equipment. They were able to empty the privy tubs regularly, scrub the floors, wash the clothing and provide nutritious meals for the wounded soldiers, as well as providing psychological support and assisted the soldiers to send their money home. She organised the nurses' duties, supervised their activities and was fully observant of army regulations relating to what was required. Overall, the nurses reduced the in-hospital death rate from 42% to 2%, which is an amazing accomplishment. In addition, because the public were well aware of what was happening at the front, in March 1855 there was a parliamentary commission which inspected the conditions in Scutari and Sevastopol, and this acted properly to change the conditions. So we can say that two figures overall emerged from the Crimea as heroic, the soldier and the nurse. That's another lithograph showing the conditions. But out of the reports relating to the conditions and the nursing activities, the legend was born. And that was further added to by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote in 1857, "Lo, in that hour of mystery, a lady with a lamp I see, passed through the glimmering gloom and fled from room to room." So the lady and the lamp, the legend. It's probably not the case that it was a lamp, as in Aladdin's lamps, but it was probably a Turkish fanus. Sorry, that's spelling error.
Fanas.
Sorry?
Fanas.
Fanas, thank you. A Turkish fanas that she used when doing her nightly rounds in the wards. Thank you. Excuse my pronunciation and spelling. So, the end of 1855, the war came to a conclusion, and Russia accepted a humiliating defeat with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1856. The conditions of the treaty were that it forbade Russia from basing warships in the Black Sea, and the Orthodox Church regained Christian churches in dispute. It's interesting that it was pivotal in reforming industrialisation in Russia and changing a number of the social institutions there, such as serfdom. also education and military service. And those changes eventually led to the Russian Revolution. So if you're looking at the outcomes of war, that was one of the potential outcomes. Florence ultimately returned to Derbyshire on the 7th of August 1856. So if we look at what were some of the legacies of the Crimean War, not just the casualties, which I'll come to shortly, it employed trench warfare during the siege of Sevastopol for troop protection. It was the first use of telegraph for communication. It also used extensive use of railroads for transportation, and it evolved the use of royal commissions into military hospitals, particularly in this instance when there were deaths from disease far outnumbered those killed in action. It also saw changes in the military armaments with breech-loading artillery, with the mini ball being introduced as rifle ammunition, which went into extensive use in the American Civil War, and also a change in naval artillery. That's the mini ball that was used and evolved during the Crimean War. There were other political aftermaths of the Crimean War. It had a disruptive influence on the standing order of the times and the major powers after 40 years of peace following 1815. And for the first time in centuries, the British and the French were allies, not enemies. It's interesting to note that Napoleon III, who was pivotal in leading the French troops, turned out to be probably the most influential leader because he adhered to the policy of order of command much better than the British commanders did. The fragmented states of Italy were united following the decline in Austrian influence. It was not overall regarded as a great war, but it did involve the interests of the five great powers of the day. It was also large in terms of space and cost. And to some extent, it started to enhance contemporary technology arising from warfare. However, the statistics are not great in terms of casualties. At the Battle of Balaclava in the charge of the Light Brigade on October the 25th, there were approximately 660 men, 118 were killed, 127 wounded, 60 were taken prisoner, and only 195 still had their horses at the end. The loss of life in the war was enormous, of 1.65 million soldiers, all nations who began 900,000 died. It is still a lot less than those in World War I, but for the size of the campaigns it was enormous. More soldiers died of disease, mainly cholera, than in battles, and you can see there the numbers for each country, with Britain almost 20,000 losses, France 75,000 died of disease, and in Russia killed in action 50,000 and died of disease 60,000. Horrendous figures of loss of life. So the question is, can you name any current concepts that had their origin in the Crimean War?
Learn about and bury.
Probably.
Because bullet beef tins came in during the Crimean War.
Yeah, so I'm not going to have enough thoughts for all these wonderful answers, but we'll try and get there.
Do you mean nursing concepts?
No, general concepts. Nursing concepts, certainly lots of nursing concepts, but just general concepts from war, I guess.
Stop Russia from going to Crimea.
Would have been nice.
Royal commissions?
Well, we've mentioned that there were royal commissions that arise, and I'm thinking of, I guess I've chosen three that come to my mind.
Wouldn't it have greatly raised the status of nurses?
Yes, it certainly raised status of nurses, but I'm thinking of that certainly started to happen, yes. But I'm thinking of three other concepts, and so I know I agree with everything that you said. But Paul,
I'm pretty sure, can I say law of art and conflict?
Yes.
sorry?
The protocols that arose, the law of art and conflict for the treatment of casualties and prisoners evolved from there in a treaty that was signed within the next 10 years.
I think you're right in that
Yeah.
regard, yes.
You could no longer buy your commission, you had to earn it through study.
Yeah, so I think that was one of the issues about the commanders in the Crimean War as to both their inexperience, their incompetence and their personalities. Yeah.
Triage?
Triage, probably there was to some extent, but it's not as well established as there are in other wars, particularly Vietnam, for example. Okay, so this is a photograph which actually a photograph showing which was taken by Roger Fenton during the Crimean War. Again, I think it's fascinating because you can see photographs back to 1855. And again, another photograph of the encampment of the British soldiers. And you can see Constantinople in the background. So basically, what I'm thinking now, this was the first major war that featured civilian journalists. And so William Howard Russell, who was an Irish journalist working for the Times, is attributed to providing the first dispatches from the Crimean War to the British papers. And so we're all aware of how the media can influence events relating to wartime. And this was the first time that there were major war correspondents at the war. Also, it was in some of the reports you read, they say that Leo Tolstoy was a journalist for the Russian newspapers, but in fact he was there as a second lieutenant in the Russian artillery, and he was based at the siege of Sevastopol, and he wrote a number of stories, 3 stories entitled December, May and August, to the Russian media, and his experiences and observations he actually used in War and Peace. So the media, in terms of reporting on action, this was the first occurrence. Another concept, and I accept everything that everyone has said, but there was a concept of just relating to the Battle of Balaclava, that the Heavy Brigade were put in place as first line of defence by Commander Colin Campbell. He had a low opinion of the Russian soldiers, and he lined up his men only 2 soldiers deep and told them to die rather than to move. And William Russell was the correspondent who reported at that time, and he wrote as he watched, the Russians dash at the Highlanders, the grounds fly beneath their horses' feet, gathering speed at every stride. They dash onwards towards the thin red streak, topped with a line of steel. And the concept that arose from that action was the thin red line, which nowadays we've adopted as the thin blue line. The second concept, I'm surprised you didn't think of, the Victoria Cross. So previously there was only the Order of the Bath close to the French Legion of Honour that was bestowed on senior officers. But Queen Victoria established the Victoria Cross for the brave, designed and produced in Hancock's of London in 1857. Traditionally, every Victoria Cross medal is said to have been made using bronze cascabel from 2 Russian cannons captured at the siege of Sevastopol, originally held at Woolwich Barracks. However, modern research would suggest that metal came from many other sources, including Chinese cannon seized by the Russians and even unlearned cannon. The remains of the cannons are now stored at Ministry of Defence, Donington in Shropshire. So the Victoria Cross is ongoing from those days. So what about the Crimea today? Someone mentioned about the Russians in Crimea. You can see there where it's situated adjacent to Ukraine. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea following a referendum. and administers the Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol as two federal subjects of Russia, and claimed it to be fully integrated in July 2015. Ukrainian majority of international governments continue to regard Crimea as an integral part of Crimea, and there's been considerable protest in the Ukraine following annexation. Now 10 years later, and the geopolitical situation in that region is as we know. Not a lot changes after 171 years. So this is a picture taken at the time of the Crimean War. That's across from what is now Istanbul. That's the view today, and you can actually go and visit there. Go across the Bosphorus and visit the hospital. And part of the building is now the barracks of the Turkish First Army Group. I think it's always interesting when you go to battlefield sites and you see the then and now. And that's the now pictures of what was quite famous in the day. We need to focus more on Florence and her achievements after the Crimean War. It is primarily a legacy for nurses, and she established the foundation philosophy of modern nursing, as well as social reform in healthcare. She established the Nightingale Fund in 1855 and the first nursing school in 1860, which is at St Thomas's Hospital. It was a model that has been adopted worldwide. At that time, she also mentored Linda Richards, and you might say, well, who's Linda Richards? Linda Richards was the first American who was mentored by Florence Nightingale, who went back to the United States and established nursing schools in the US around the time of the American Civil War. In 1862, she established training for midwives and nurses, and the Liverpool Workhouse Infirmary is now part of King's College Hospital from those days. It was the first time that anyone had introduced trained professionals into the British workhouse system. The workhouse system was deplorable, and there were many people injured and dying in that circumstances in the Victorian era. And she was the first person to actually train nurses to go into that setting and provide care. She overall, as already been said, she created a viable and respectable profession for women. This is not something that women did in the Victorian era. So it's quite an amazing woman. She wrote 200 books, pamphlets and articles, and over 14,000 letters relating to nursing, religion, philosophy, sanitation, army hygiene, hospitals, statistics and India. In 1859, she published Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, which is in continuous publication to this day. There's also acknowledged the Florence Nightingale Medal and the Florence Nightingale Award, which are given to nurses who show courage and devotion in various settings. I'm very privileged this morning to actually see a replica this morning, which it's been held by one of our guests here today, Chris, who's got replicas of the medals. So it's quite outstanding to see these beautiful medals. As we've said, she established the Royal Commission leading to reform for the British military health system. She travelled to India quite extensively and wrote a lot about the health and living conditions there, and advocated for better hunger relief for India. She provided advice to the US Union government in relation to medicine at the time. She also helped abolish prostitution laws that were harsh for women. She wrote extensively also on religion and mysticism. And she was a pioneer in displaying statistical charts for those of us who don't like statistics. She also had that in her part of her ability. And she devised a graph which she named Coxcomb, and it's basically a pie chart with different angles and variable radii, which depicts health information. The Nightingale Rose. She was also pivotal in looking at hospital design, as I said earlier, and focusing on the pavilion principle. And hospital design important to have high ceilings, lots of air, light and organisation. Still the case today. And this is the completed pavilion plan of St Thomas's Hospital that was built along with her recommendations in 1871. Her achievements post-war in 1883 became the first recipient of the Royal Red Cross. In 1904 appointed a Lady of the Grace of the Order of St John, and in 1907 became the first woman to be awarded the Order of Merit. In 1908 was given the freedom of the City of London, and we recognise May the 12th annually as International Nursing Day, which is the day of her birth. Just to mention the Order of Merit, instituted in 1902 by King Edward VII, must be returned upon the death of the recipient, and it's the sole gift coming from the sovereign for distinguished services and exceptional service during warfare. You can see there a number of the recipients of the Order of Merit, including John Howard in 2012, Dame Joan Sutherland, Sir Sidney Nolan, Sir Richard Attenborough, amongst others. And the Order of Merit, that is what it looks like. So since those times and all the wonderful achievements, there have been a lot of tributes, and time and space does not enable me to include all the tributes that have flowed on related to Florence. There have been multiple memorial statues and windows. 4 hospitals have been named in her honour in Istanbul. The US Air Force operated a fleet of Nightingale aeromedical evacuation aircraft in service until 2005. And in 1981 she even had an asteroid named after her, Florence. The International Committee, as I said, in 1912 instituted the Florence Nightingale Medal for exceptional courage and devotion to the care of wounded, sick and disabled in conflict or as a result of disasters. And the UN General Assembly had the Florence Nightingale Declaration in 2008 related to preventive medicine and holistic care. She was the first woman, apart from the sovereigns, to appear on a £10 English £10 note from 1975 to 1994. And welcome to the USS Florence Nightingale, one of the few US ships that's been named after a woman. It saw service in World War II, North Africa, the Normandy invasion and Okinawa. Fun fact, it's listed here that it carried Project Paperclip V2 rocket scientists to New York in 1945. It was eventually decommissioned in 1946 and sold for scrap in 1970. But on the list of things that USS Florence Nightingale did was that it was one of 6 ships that arrived in Brisbane in February 1942. Just for your general trivia information. And of course there have been many books and films. I just put one up here that I remember seeing years ago with Anna Nagel and Michael Wilde in The Lady with the Lamb. And as I said, 12th of May is the International Nurses Day. So at the time of meeting, I quickly look at Florence Nightingale and the Sydney connection, because there is one. In 1866, after the death of a patient at what was then called the Sydney Infirmary, which was described as filthy and covered in vermin, the MP for East Sydney, Sir Henry Parkes, appealed to Florence Nightingale for trained nurses for the colony from the London Nursing School in July 1866. And in March 1868, Lucy Osborne arrived with 5 nurses from the nursing school. And they had trained for 1 year at the Nightingale School of Nursing and the Kaiserwerth Hospital. The nurses were Mary Barker, Eliza Blundell, Annie Miller, Haldane Torriff and Bessie Chad, who were respectable, healthy and intelligent women and careful and efficient nurses. That is Lucy Osborne, and for those of you who haven't been, you should visit the Lucy Osborne Museum at Sydney Hospital. It has restricted hours, you need to ring and make an appointment, but it shows Lucy Osborne's office and a lot of the things attributed to the early arrival of those nurses, as well as a whole host of museum specimens. So I would encourage you all to go to Sydney Hospital to the museum. It's well worth a visit. And that's an interior of the Women's Surgical Hospital in the 1890s with those pavilion aspects. I remember when I first started in medicine, the wards at Prince Alfred looked like that. They're a bit different nowadays. The nurses gained notoriety 1 week after arrival because of an attempted assassination on the first royal visitor, the Prince Alfred Ernest Albert, Duke of Edinburgh, who came here in March 1868. There was an attempted assassination of the Duke 1 week after his arrival at a picnic at Clontarf, and that was by Henry James O'Farrell. And the Duke of Edinburgh was nursed back to health by the nurses under Lucy Osborne at Government House, not Sydney Hospital. Henry O'Farrell was subsequently tried in Darlinghurst Court and was sentenced to death by hanging. By all accounts, he had mental illness, but mental illness in those days was not an excuse for illegal behaviour. Subsequently, the original nurses became matrons in other hospitals in New South Wales and laid the foundation of modern nursing. Florence Nightingale never visited Sydney herself, but she did endorse the design of the Nightingale wing of Sydney Hospital, which is in the Gothic Revival style, built in 1869, and it was built to house the female nurses on duty. And we're all familiar with the Nightingale wing of Sydney Hospital, a beautiful brick and sandstone building, and a courtyard. There were lots of other tributes. This is just one I saw from South Australia, that the District Trained Nursing Society sent this to Florence Nightingale at the home as a gift in 1904 on the 50th anniversary of her arrival at Scutari. And just going back to the Lucy Osborne Museum, when I was there earlier this year, this was the Nightingale badge that was awarded to the museum in February by the Nightingale Fellowship in London in memory and honour of all Nightingale trained nurses. So her memory lives on in many forms. Florence Nightingale passed away in sleep on the 13th of August 1910 in Mayfair, London at the age of 90. She's buried at St Margaret's Churchyard in East Wellow, Hampshire. She declined our burial at Westminster Abbey. It was her wish to have a private funeral and to be buried with her parents in Hampshire. A memorial service was subsequently held at St Paul's Cathedral. And if you look at the proceedings of the memorial service, there was something like 75 wreaths sent by organisations to the memorial service. It's an enormous number. The Dean of Westminster Abbey subsequently rededicated the Nurses Memorial Chapel in the Abbey to Florence Nightingale on the centenary of her death. But she had a very private funeral. She had wished for 2 people to carry her coffin, which was probably an impossible task. There were no crowds that accompanied her coffin that left Mayfair to be placed on the special train at Waterloo Station. And there was a simple wreath of flowers from the survivors of the Balaclava Light Brigade. Her body was borne to the grave by 6 British Army sergeants against her wishes, drawn from several regiments of the Guard, of the Guards. And you can see there a picture of the Guards carrying her coffin. Lots of quotations attributed to Florence Nightingale. And it is this wonderful technology. There is a recording dating back to 1890 of her voice that you can listen to. So you can actually listen to Florence Nightingale speaking those words. When I am no longer even their register name, I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work of my life. God bless my dear old comrades of our Father and bring them safe to shore. And that's it's in the British Library Sound Archive, and I think you can hear it online, her actual voice. Yes, you can. Something to do. And that's very few pictures of Florence Nightingale, but I really like that picture. It's gorgeous. It shows a woman in her 80s who is very content that she's been able to achieve so much with the talents that she was given. So thank you very much for your attention.
So we have time for questions, if anyone has any questions.
What did she do in her spare time?
She never married, so she was busy with her profession. She was in a short-term relationship. She never even had an engagement, so she didn't have a personal life. She had a number of close female friends.
Did she have any influence at all on ambulance services that were pretty rudimentary, no doubt in her day, but came into their own during World War I?
I have to look at that. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. Does anyone know?
It's John Lappin in his book Military Surgeon addresses that.
Yes.
About the ambulance
About
services.
the so did she have any involvement or not?
I don't think she did, because it started in a different way.
Yes, I didn't read anything to that. No.
Lappin devotes a whole chapter to this.
Yeah.
Florence was asked to assemble the nurse and take her out to the Crimea by a politician, yet the doctors ignored. How can the doctors sort of, and that seems to be strange, politicians get the team taken out there and the doctors ignore them. Why was that?
Doctors have always done that to nurses. I mean, the old expression was that the nurses were handmaidens of the doctors, and it's a hierarchy thing, and it's unfortunate because that was wrong.
It's not related, but my mother was an under matron at St Thomas's until 1939. And she always stated quite clearly it was matrons who ran the hospital, the doctors were there to do medicine.
And that's very true. They do have a different role. And remember, nurses are there 24 hours a day, and they really do focus on the patient, whereas doctors focus on the disease too, as well as patients.
Just to point out that the Crimean War was only 60 years old before it arrived to the city. You seem to have a lot of British factions, but we would point out, of course, without the British and without her, we wouldn't have got this far. So even though we're being critical, it was the British, in fact. And I did notice in the number being killed, the French were about 5 times as many.
That's true.
So for whatever the faults might have been with the British, they did have better results.
I only mention the faults because that's what a lot of people are focused on, mismanagement. But there, I also try to point out it was also courage under fire as well.
Did she ever openly go against war? Put out against war?
It's a good question. I think that there were some elements of that. I certainly know that Leo Tolstoy did, based on his observations of the siege of Sebastopol. He was very much anti-war. So it's a good question. I think there probably were those elements, but I think she focused more on what she could do that was positive for the wounded.
Just speaking about both, you can speak about both medicine and military matters in this, and that I've often said that nations never learn from the mistakes of other nations, they only learn by making them themselves. The American Civil War, which I studied extensively, came only 5 years after the Crimea, and they made almost every mistake all over again in spades. Especially, it's interesting to note in the Civil War, more than 2/3 of the casualties were related to poor sanitation, poor health, poor nursing, poor medical conditions.
Yes, I think I read somewhere when I was in Richmond that
there was something like 50,000 casualties in 1 month or something that they had to deal with.
That's
Enormous
right,
numbers,
that's right.
enormous numbers.
Yeah,
They really
massive
were.
outbreaks of dysentery, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, we're hearing a lot, or been told a lot, about Mary Seacole, who it
Yes,
seems at one time actually met Florence Nightingale. Do you know anything about that
What I
relationship?
read about Mary Seacole was that she tried to join the nurses in Scutari at the time, and Florence must have had an opinion about her that she reported that she was concerned about the bad influence that Mary would have on the nurses because of her drinking. That she reported that she had a problem with alcohol.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so I did read about that particular nurse.
I
Yeah.
thought she sort of ran a posh hotel for officers.
She did.
She wasn't
She did.
actually caring for the ordinary soldiers.
No, she did, and I think Mary didn't. Florence didn't have a high opinion of
Yes,
Mary
I-
as a nurse.
Hard to imagine, isn't it?
Mm.
Right. Oh, thank you for that.
Can we won't have any more questions because we are running out of time. But can we put our hands together? Can we put our hands together? And